Hey guys, Bartel's Bookshelf here, and today I'm going to be reviewing the novelization of the film Forbidden Zone, written by Joshua Millican. I finished the book out at home, and I'm back in Foster City for the last few weeks of Aaron's job, so I don't have it with me, but I'll put a picture up here or here, wherever. I mentioned this in my previous Wishmaster review. I wanted to read more novelizations from this publisher, Encyclopocalypse Publications, because in the last few years they've been putting out novelizations of 80s and 90s cult horror classics that were never originally novelized. And I saw that Forbidden Zone was on there, and Forbidden Zone is one of my favorite movies. It was one of the first movies that Aaron and I bonded over. And it's also incredibly bizarre, and so I was curious, how the hell do you novelize this? It's a musical, for one, and two, it's just so anarchic, and there's so little semblance of a plot that, like, how the fuck do you turn that into a book? So yeah, I actually finished this a couple days ago, but I've been lazy about getting the video filmed. Sorry about that, but I finally read it, and it was interesting. So the plot, such as there is about a family, the Hercules family, who have a portal to the sixth dimension in the basement of their home that leads to the Forbidden Zone, which is run by this tyrant king and queen. The king is this little person played by Hervé Villechaize from Fantasy Island, and Nick Nack from Man with the Golden Gun, and his wife, Queen Doris, who is played by Susan Terrell, who's a character actress. She was a voice in Wizards, and she was in Butcher Baker, Nightmare Maker, and a bunch of other things. And Fausto, the king, falls in love with Frenchie, the young sister of the Hercules family, the young daughter, and it's essentially just an excuse for a bunch of weird, off-kilter jokes and surreal humor, and it's an excuse for Danny Elfman to show off his band, the Mystic Knights of the Oingo Boingo. It was directed by his brother, Richard Elfman, and it was Danny's first real big project as a composer. It was the first film he ever did music for. It was the first appearance of his band, Oingo Boingo, which, eventually became their own big thing in the 80s. It was filmed in black and white on a very low budget, but it was colorized recently. And then more recently, there was a director's cut put out that changed a few things, which I'll get into eventually. So yeah, going into this, as I mentioned, I was really curious about how the hell they novelized this, and it was actually interesting. So the book it really kind of matches the tone of the movie in a lot of ways, in that it has this kind of similarly anarchic, everything but the kitchen sink kind of view, sort of style to it. Much like the movie, stuff just sort of happens out of nowhere, and it's very over the top. The thing that I was thinking about that actually sort of struck me as I was reading it was that in terms of tone, it feels a lot like bizarro fiction from authors like Carlton Mellick III and publishers like Eraserhead Press and things like that. It's very anarchic, it's very absurdist, very surreal, very gleefully offensive, which again is all keeping in tone with the movie. And that kind of made me realize, like, I wonder if you could consider Forbidden Zone the first sort of bizarro film, if that is a classification that exists. And I think that was the right way to go with it. I think couching it in those kind of surrealist, absurd terms of just bizarreness, I think, is the only real way you could have adapted the book or the movie. The book expands on a lot of things, as a lot of novelizations do. It goes more into the history of Grandpa Hercules, how he was, Killer Kowalski, the most violent Jewish boxer in the world. It explains a few things about the plot that didn't need to be explained, but are explained in an appropriately bizarre way. So, for example, Frenchie in the movie is, a French woman. She speaks French, she sings French, Edith Piaf songs and stuff, and there's no real explanation as to why. It's just part of the absurdism of the film. But in the book, they explain that she spent a year studying in France, and she enjoyed France so much, and she spent so much time there, that her DNA literally changed, and she literally physically became French, like a disease or something. And they explain that the same thing happened to King Fausto, and that's why he's French. They also explain that Flash Hercules, who in the film is supposed to be like a young boy, but he's played by an old man, which is, part of the joke. But in the book, they explain that he has an advanced state of progeria, which is, that aging disease that some people get. It's very rare. So just little things like that like I said, they're not necessarily things that needed to be explained, but they fit with the kind of bizarre nature of the film. So it really, I think it kind of works. There's also scenes in the book that are adapted from the film, but in the film they're kind of low key, and so you don't really think about them. But in the book, they're turned into these like big epic set pieces. Like in the movie, there's a scene where Grandpa Hercules beats this like gorilla creature to death until its brains are all over the floor. And in the movie, it's just, as I said, it's this weird kind of low key, sort of cartoonish thing. But in the book, it's like this big, like, epic set piece where they're, like, trapped in this septic tank and there's all this crazy stuff going on. And, like, instead of a guy in a gorilla suit, it's like this giant malodorous creature that he, like, has this epic fight with, you know? So it's almost like expanding the scope of the movie, and letting it breathe and be able to do things that they couldn't do on a lower budget, which I thought was interesting. There's also a lot of Oingo Boingo references for fans. You know, they reference some of the classics like, you know, Dead Man's Party and Weird Science. I was actually surprised during the scene where Pa Hercules is working in the factory that they didn't slip in a wild sex in the working class reference somewhere. So yeah, overall, I think it's an interesting and pretty accurate and pretty faithful, in terms of tone, adaptation of the film. It falters in a few places for me. I think part of that is just it's really hard to kind of capture the tone of the movie fully, especially without the music. I mean, you don't have any of the music in the book, obviously, but they still adapt some of the lyrics and situations into dialogue, which kind of works, but the whole time I just kept thinking about the music and how I kind of missed what I wasn't hearing. But that's just kind of inevitable. There's no real way to capture that, you know? There was also, compared to the previous Encyclopocalypse book I read, which was Wishmaster, there was a ton of like errors in this one, you know, typos and grammatical things. Tense changes constantly. There's like a misspelling pretty much on every page. Normally, I'm not super anal about that sort of stuff, but in this case, like it was so frequent and it you know, it happened so much that it kind of took me out of the book a little bit. Not a huge deal, but you know, Encyclopocalypse, if you guys need a proofreader, I'm happy to do that. I would love to do that. I fucking do that anyway when I'm reading books. I'm always noticing shit like that. But, you know, again, that's just kind of something of, that's kind of a symptom of a lot of smaller presses, I think. But the main thing was that, one, the book makes a lot of like modern pop culture references, or more sort of modern pop culture references. Like it'll and it's not that the original movie didn't do that. I mean, the original movie is very much one large reference, or sort of trying to evoke that old 1930s, you know, Max Fleischer cartoon vibe, you know, Betty Boop, that sort of thing, mixed with, you know, more modern stuff at the time it was made, you know, with like the new wave and things like that. But it really kind of refrained from direct pop cultural references. Like, nobody looks at the camera and says, this is like that movie so-and-so, but the book does it a lot. And it references stuff that was more modern than when the movie originally came out. Like, it talks about, you know, Michael Myers and stuff like that. Or like, you know, slasher villains, or like, you know, modern horror, or like Land of the Lost, which I get Land of the Lost was before the movie came out. But, you know, but the movie never made any of those direct cultural references, and to me, like, it felt a little bit too obvious sometimes, kind of purposefully like pointing out like something that you're referencing as sort of verbal shorthand for what you're trying to describe, and it just sort of didn't really fit with the vibe of what it was adapting, in my opinion. And there were a few moments that were sort of and again, this is related to what I was saying about the director's cut. In the original cut of the film, there are some brief examples of intentionally offensive and surrealistic blackface. There's a few F slurs and things like that, you know, which, not to defend it, but that was the modus operandi of the film. It was trying to be shocking. It was trying to be offensive. It was using it, you know, obviously, like, blackface is shocking now, and it was shocking then, and that's why they were using it the way they were. But it was surrealist in the sense that the actors in blackface were black actors themselves, you know, so it's this weird meta thing. And also it kind of ties into, you know, that whole 1930s vibe, you know, Max Fleischer, obviously those old cartoons had a lot of racial stereotypes, you know. Again, not defending it, but that's the way it is. In the film and in the book, they replace a lot of the blackface where one of the guys is colored green and another guy is turned into a clown, which, again, like, I think kind of fits into the absurdity of it. So I don't mind that so much. But in regards to the character Renee, who is one of the characters, Squeeze-It's sister, she's essentially described as like a trans woman, although we wouldn't have used that terminology back then. But in the film, she's kind of just treated as like, you know, a guy who dresses like a broad, and they call her an F slur a few times in the book and the film. In the book, there's two separate, really long asides during these scenes where, you know, they're pointing out that, you know, like, oh, Renee's an F slur and all this stuff, where the author kind of stops the story dead for like 2 or 3 paragraphs just to explain, like, oh, back then we didn't understand what, you know, being trans was, and blah, 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 blah. And I get it. I totally get it, especially considering the time that this book was written very recently. You know, violence and transphobic hatred is like rampant right now. I understand that you're trying not to stoke those flames. Me personally, as, you know, a queer person, you know, I'm not trans, but you know, I am part of the community. I don't know. It felt like a little bit too much of a course correction, in my opinion. I think that you could have found ways to sort of integrate a more sort of open-minded viewpoint on it without necessarily stopping the story to kind of explain your thought process. Especially because, as I said, this whole piece is meant to be sort of willfully offensive and wildly over the top, you know, to everybody. You know, there's tons of Jewish stereotypes in the film and the book. You know, the Elfmans were Jewish. There's a whole song called the Yiddish Charleston. You know, there's a scene in you know, where they go to the Jewish dimension in the you know, they go to the what do they call it? In the book, they call it the circumcision zone, which is like this big Jewish dimension within the 6th dimension and stuff like that. You know, and at no point at any of those moments does the author stop the story to explain, well, yes, this was offensive, but, you know, which again, I understand to an extent, because you know, transgender people and gender expression and that whole kind of thing is sort of the hot button issue of the day right now. You know, deservedly so. I'm pro-trans. I'm on the side of trans people, but I don't know. It felt a bit weird to be kind of picking and choosing which parts to sort of over-explain and which parts like people would get offended at when the whole thing is meant to be offensive, if that makes sense. I don't know. That's just my opinion on it. And I'm not saying, as I said, I'm not saying that you can't rewrite these things and sort of come at them from try to come at them from a more open-minded viewpoint. But as I said, when you're stopping the story for like several paragraphs, multiple times, you know, usually whenever Renee is brought up and referred to with any kind of slur, they kind of stop the story to like go over like, yes, we know this is offensive, but, and that really just kind of took me out of the story a few times. But at the end of the day, I think it does expand on a lot of the lore of the movie in a way that feels appropriately anarchic and wild. It's very colorfully written. I was looking up Josh Millican because I'd never heard of him before, and it turns out he has some horror cred. He was editor-in-chief for Dread Central for like 2 or 3 years. And before that, you know, he wrote tons of articles for Dread Central and things like that. And he has a podcast where he interviews kind of cult horror figures and stuff, including Richard Elfman at one point. So he clearly, like, he knows what he's talking about, and and I think he writes with that kind of anarcho-punk sort of sensibility that I think fits the tone of the film really well. I just think there were a few missteps, that, you know, and a few sort of inevitable pitfalls that meant he couldn't entirely capture the tone of the movie. But as I said, it's such an indescribable movie. Like, how do you capture that? I showed it to Laura and Nakia after reading the book, you know, because I was going to rewatch it anyway, and I was like, oh, well, let me introduce you guys. And at the end, throughout the movie, they like Laura had her head in her hands like this, and like they were just kind of staring at the screen like this, you know, like. And they probably thought I was insane by the end of it, but I hope they enjoyed it. I'm sure they'll leave a comment and say if they did. But one other thing that I also thought was kind of interesting about the movie, me and my friends have been watching Vivzy Pop's shows. We finished Has Been Hotel a while ago, and we're working our way through Hell of a Boss. And I was thinking about it, and you know, I think there's a direct through line from Forbidden Zone to that type of you know, Has Been Hotel type stuff, because they're both very similar in the sense that They're both mixing the old and the new. Forbidden Zone is very much in that 1930s Max Fleischer style, Cab Calloway, that type of thing, mixed with, what was at the time modern, sort of elements from the new wave, from the punk era, from that DIY kind of grungy sort of aesthetic, smashing everything together into one big mess. It's a musical. Same thing with that sort of Vivzy Pop style stuff. It's willfully, gleefully offensive at times. It's mixing, the old Broadway style with, sort of cartoon aesthetic, mixed with, sort of more modern kind of goth Newgrounds vibes, and kind of that Tumblr fangirl kind of aesthetic. And again, they're both musicals. So that was something that I thought was really interesting, a sort of interesting little through line that I gathered from watching all of these things in quick succession that I thought you guys might find interesting. So yeah, it was an interesting book. I don't know that it was entirely successful in adapting the thing it was adapting. At the end of the day, it does capture a lot of that sensibility, and I think it's imaginative and entertaining enough that it serves as a very fun companion to the film. And I'm very excited I'm really excited to see more of what this publisher puts out. As I mentioned before, they've got a Chopping Mall novelization coming out. They've got a Plan 9 novelization coming out. So again, I'm going to link them in the description. If you guys are into cult 80s and 90s horror, if you love like novelizations, keep this stuff in mind. Check this stuff out. I think they'll be doing a lot of interesting things in the future. So that was my somewhat rambling review of the Forbidden Zone novelization by Joshua Millican. I hope you guys enjoyed, and until then, I'll see you guys next time. Bye.